Welcome everyone to our Google Hangout, Analyzing Photographs in the U.S. History Classroom. You are in the right place right now. We're going to start in just about 2 minutes. Analyzing photographs. In the meantime, feel free to ask questions in live chat on the right-hand side of your screen, and we'll get started in just a few minutes. Thanks. Welcome everyone to Analyzing Photography in the U.S. History Classroom. This session is brought to you by the Smithsonian Learning Lab. My name is Ashley Naranjo. I'm an educator at the Smithsonian Center for Learning and Digital Access. I'm joined today with Shannon Perich from the National Museum of American History. Today, we're going to demonstrate some ways that you can use some of the resources that are found within the Smithsonian Learning Lab, specifically photographs. If you want to visit the Learning Lab, it's available at learninglab.si.edu. And both an archive of this online session, as well as a collection of complementary resources are available there at learninglab.si.edu. Additionally, this is the second in a series of Hangouts. The first Hangout that we led this year was focusing on objects. And so we were again joined by a colleague from the National Museum of American History. And you can view the archived session of the Objects Hangout, as well as all of the complementary resources that are available via the Learning Lab. And the link is there, and that'll also be available through the Learning Lab if you just search objects as evidence to answer essential questions. Additionally, this year, we also were joined by an educator from the National Portrait Gallery, where she demonstrated how to use portraiture to teach the struggle for justice. Again, that's available on the Learning Lab as well. So this is the third Hangout in our series. We should give special thanks to the Grable Foundation in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, for their support of this session. These sessions are complementary to workshops that are going on in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, in conjunction with the Heinz History Center, supporting high school U.S. history teachers. Of course, because it's online, all are welcome to participate. Next, just a few housekeeping. If you're interested in asking our presenter any questions, you can use the chat box on the right-hand side of the video player, and you can ask questions or ask for clarifications, and we'll get to them throughout the session. Finally, I just wanted to mention that Shannon is no stranger to collaborating with us on offering some great digital resources for teachers in the classroom. And so you can also find additional archived sessions with Shannon through the next up, the next one that she did with us was the inauguration images over time. So this was just about 4 years ago over the second Obama inauguration. And then finally, there's also a collection from a past lesson plan that we had collaborated on, in which students can examine farewell messages written in an 1860 Rutgers College yearbook. And what's interesting about this is the yearbook's owner was actually a Southerner at a Northern college. And so being able to closely examine these messages and understand some of the complexities of the Civil War. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Shannon Perich from the National Museum of American History, and she'll take us on a tour of how to use photography in the U.S. history classroom. Shannon?
Thank you, Ashley. So great to join all of you today. As you'll see on the next slide, we're going to cover 4 areas today. We'll be talking about individual photographs as a document. We'll look at yearbooks and albums, and we'll have a peek at some fine art photography, and then maybe we can discuss some ideas for classroom use of photographs when you consider photographs as historical documents. So about historical documents, I'd like to hold in our minds 2 concepts and 2 assumptions. So whatever we're looking at, let's assume that every photograph is going to tell a story. So if we're looking at what the photographer is trying to convey to us, rather than an art historical message, perhaps, we can figure out what we need to know from the photograph. And the second is that the image is comprised of layers. So there's going to be multiple answers and multiple ways to enter into the photograph. Certainly we can, it's like an onion, we can choose to take the first 3 layers and we can go all the way to the bottom, but what I'd like us to think about is just 3 layers. So we're going to look for those 3 basic starting points to put together subject matter, form, and context in order to get to what the meaning of the photograph is. Now, if you happen to have the title or the caption, or we know the materials or where it appeared, then I would consider that bonus material. And sometimes we know those things and sometimes we don't. So let's try this out on our first photograph. This is probably a photograph that you know. So just as a reminder, we're going to talk about form, subject matter, form, and context. So maybe jot down some ideas that you have. Do you know this photograph? Have you seen it before? Do you happen to know its common name? So if we just look at that briefly, you might know that it's often called Migrant Mother. If we examine what we can see in the photograph, we can see a woman. She has 2 small children. And in fact, she's holding an infant, if you can see on the right-hand side. In the corner there's the face of a small child. And then running up the right-hand side is the tent pole. And you can see a canvas behind her. Now, as we continue to look at this, we can continue to describe the woman. She clearly is not a wealthy woman. We can go to the next slide, and it has some prompts for some questions. We can tell that she's not wealthy. In fact, she looks a little bit dirty. The children certainly are dirty. So we're beginning to build a context for how we understand and what we can see that's actually in the photograph. If we look at the composition and the form of the photograph, it looks like some things we've seen before, which might be religious paintings, which is where the title comes from, Migrant Mother, where people often want to associate her with a kind of Mary figure. And oftentimes you'll see angels or children next to putti, next to those Mary figures. It's also interesting because the children have their faces turned away, and everything, including her hand, keeps bringing us right back to her face. So the other thing that you might notice if we look at the bonus component is that up on the left-hand side, there are numbers there. And at the bottom of the photograph, we can see it says Kodak. So we know that this is a film photograph, a film image, as opposed to a digital image. So that might be interesting to look for in terms of how was this image made, and thinking about how many opportunities the photographer may have had to make this image. Now, you probably recognize the photograph. You know it. You've seen it a lot of times. We're going to look at this photograph and 3 others. And they were selected because they are iconic American images. And we're going to see this image over and over in a variety of ways. So students actually need to know this in terms of visual culture as an American icon. It's a stamp, it's t-shirts, there are kinds of protest images that are wrapped around the idea of who this woman is and the migrant mother. We've included a nice overview that the Library of Congress has conducted or has done so that you can dig a little deeper. One of the things that's interesting about this photograph, as we know it is Migrant Mother, is when you actually go to the Library of Congress website, the title for it is Destitute Pea Pickers in California, period, mother of 7, period, age 32, period, Nipomo, California, 1936. So when you begin to put that information together and what we think this image is about, becomes kind of interesting. She has no name. What happens when you don't have a name of this woman? She just becomes representative of all women. The story behind this photograph is that it was made by Dorothea Lange. It's an FSA photograph. Dorothea Lange had been out in the countryside doing her thing, making photographs that Roy Stryker had asked her to make. And she's on her way home. She's tired. She's got lots of film. And she passes a sign that says pea pickers. And she drives, and it's nagging at her. So she turns around and she goes back and she goes into the camp and she comes across this woman. They don't really ever speak as far as we know. She goes in, she makes several photographs, she goes away, she goes home, she looks at the film, she likes this image, and she holds it back. She sends all the other film back to Washington, D.C., but she holds this one. She winds up sending it to a newspaper in Chicago, and they publish it simply with the same title that I just read to you. Now, what happens is that it moves people. They see her as needing help. The people of Chicago sent $10,000 to Nipomo, California to help out the pea pickers in California and the migrant farmers. So it's interesting to see how powerful this image is and that it had the effect of being able to move people to action. So it's one of the reasons why this becomes an important photograph. It's also interesting because had this been a man, it wouldn't have worked that way. If she had not had the children, it might not have worked that way. So it's important to talk about the family structure and the expectations of what women were to do, how women were treated, how largely the culture felt about women, and why that becomes such a powerful moment in 1936. So hopefully that helps to get you started a bit on looking at photographs and digging a little bit deeper. If we go to the next slide, are there any questions before we move away, or comments, or has anybody used this in a classroom?
So thus far, there aren't any questions, but just a reminder that everyone can ask questions on the right-hand side of the screen. You can type any questions regarding this image or suggestions on using this photograph in the classroom. If you've used Migrant Mother in the classroom before, we'd love to hear from you. And like I mentioned earlier, this image, as well as several of the other resources that are included within the entire online session, will be available afterwards through the Learning Lab. So you can revisit this image, you can revisit this session as well to be able to think about how this might be adaptable into your classroom. And it looks like one of our colleagues said, I've known about this photograph for years, but never heard that background before. So interesting. So I think once we dig a little bit deeper, it's interesting to learn a little bit more about the figure in this image, but also the context of how it moved people to make such an interesting action towards offering funds and supporting the woman. So,
and actually, many years later, a reporter from the Sacramento Bee tracked her down and talked to her about this photograph and the power of what it meant to stand in for every migrant mother. For this whole, she becomes the face of this entire Dust Bowl experience, and they talked to her about that and what was her life like and what did it mean to be that woman. It's a quite interesting and compelling question, what happens when you become unwittingly the face of a movement. So if we go to the other two the next slide will have 2 images on it. I selected these images. Actually, I didn't select them. I asked my son, who's a high schooler in AP history. I was telling him about this and what I was going to do and what would he want to know. And these are the 2 pictures that he wanted to know about. So I selected these. If he's interested, I assume that your high school students will be too. At the bottom of this page, there's a link for 100 photos at time.com. And all of those images are rich with videos and other kinds of content that might be more important or might be more connected to whatever it is you're teaching. But I thought I would bring these 2 forward and talk about them for just a little bit. Again, these are iconic images. These 2 images, the one before and the one we're going to see in just a moment, you can also do searches for political cartoons, and you'll see, you can show your students, and you can see how these images and the ideas that they embody become cultural touchstones or historical touchstones from which we reference contemporary experiences. So just as another reason why we need to know these as part of our visual culture. So the top photograph you're familiar with, it's Napalm Girl by Nick Utt. There's an article here that gives a really nice, that's an interview with him. He talks about the experience of photographing and why did he photograph it and how it helped to end the war. And it makes for an interesting conversation about the use of photojournalistic images. This image was an above the fold image in some places and not in others. So what happens when you are able to visualize the war? It's one thing to read about what napalm does to somebody and that it burns their clothes off and what it's like, but if you're just reading about it in a newspaper article, it is not the same as actually seeing it visualized. It's also not the same as seeing a girl completely denuded because of her, or made nude because of her, the clothes that were burned off of her back. And then the question about what do you do? Why is this photographer? What else could he do in that moment but to show the effects of what the war did and what that particular strategy was doing to the civilians. And then I put in a couple of links so you could see what Kim Phuc looks like today and what the effects are. What did she do? She has a foundation now. She took this experience, unlike the woman in Migrant Mother, she took this experience and harnessed it and has a foundation that is a result of her experience. The other thing that I think is interesting is that this image was published in on Facebook recently by I believe, Danish newspaper. And so the link here is about Facebook censorship. So there's an interesting question to be had, again, about our contemporary experiences, our contemporary technologies, our contemporary ways of getting images, photojournalistic images, and do they work in the same way as they did in other time periods. Tiananmen Square, this also is an image you know. There are several versions of it. There were 4 or 5 photographers who were there at the time. Tank Man by Jeff Widener was in Beijing in his hotel room, happened to see this image. It's a profoundly disturbing image to see this very small, fragile human being with 4 tanks aimed at him. We see it in the West as one way. We see this as a student standing up for democracy and wanting a different kind of access to information and education in China. But how do the Chinese see it? How does the Chinese government see it? This raises a question about context and who is seeing the image and whose story is it?
What I love about all 3 of these images too is just, I think, the humanity that comes through as you're looking at each of these images. I think you were right on when you said, you know, it's one thing to read about each of these specific events in history, but to actually see the images, I think is really, it evokes certain emotions and then also allows for students to start to analyze them in different ways. We also had a comment that your son is right on. He'll be glad to know that, that one of our teachers taught AP US history and used both of these images in the classroom. And so great. Well, let's move on to the next image.
This one's a little lighter and a little bit more fun, perhaps. If you've been to Times Square, there is a sculpture there that has encapsulated this particular photograph. There's a really nice article that was written by a Navy officer, actually, that you've got the link to. The next slide will have all these links so that these individual slides didn't get muddy with all those URLs. But it's a really interesting story about Alfred Eisenstaedt, who was a life photographer. This image appeared everywhere in the magazine. And it's interesting to ask, what does it express? What was this particular moment? It's VJ Day. The war is ending. How excited everybody is. Who are these people? Turns out that they actually don't know each other. She's actually not a nurse. She's a dental hygienist, but happens to have on the whites. And this always has bothered me because I can't imagine walking through Times Square and having a stranger kiss me and think that that was a good thing. So this article talks a little bit about their perspective on what that excitement was like and how overjoyed and ebullient everybody felt, and how else do you do that? So I think this one also prompts that question of that has, again, an image that the culture has embraced. We've seen it perpetuated in all kinds of reenactments and in movies and in engagement pictures, and there's a statue to it. But is it something that we would do today, and how would we celebrate? The other question here is the distribution of images. So the Tiananmen Square image was a still from a video in the 80s. The other two were film images, and this one is also a film image. And they all appeared in publication. And I think that it's really important to talk about shared experience. How do we see images today? Life magazine was so important in getting into all those living rooms and everybody being able to see the same thing. Today is our news media. Do we have the same experiences? Are we getting the same information? How do we ensure that we vary the information? How do we respond to it? So Life magazine, as you know, was really important. And it's easy to actually buy them today. So some of these iconic images that are from Life, you can find them still in magazines that are at flea markets or online at eBay, or sometimes, you know, your grandparents' attic. But it's really great for kids to see that those are real things and they're physical, and what does it look like, and what does it smell like, and what is the text that accompanies it. Okay, there are all your links that you can tap into. And again, those links at 100photos@time.com, they have videos that are about 5 minutes long, so you can get a quick and dirty download and to hear about the stories about the images and the subjects and what's happened since. So switching gears, thanks to my previous work with this organization and thinking about yearbooks, I wound up continuing to think about yearbooks more. And became a kind of funny expert on having a small expertise in the yearbook. And they really are profound objects that get overlooked because they are so common, because they are so familiar. So how do you use a yearbook? There are things that you have in your closet. There are things that the school is producing oftentimes in directly every year or have in the past. So here are some prompting questions. What is the purpose of a yearbook? What types of images and text comprise a yearbook? Who makes them and who are they for? What is specific to the school culture, the community culture? What's connected to the national culture? And what can you see that are related to events outside of the school? So if we go to the next slide, I've detailed this out a little bit more. Oh, well, I'm sorry, stay here. We'll detail it out in just a moment. The example that we're going to talk about for the yearbook today is from 1943. Rower was an internment camp in Arkansas. So this yearbook was made by a group of students who were internees during World War II. This information that I have for you is what is in the which is online at collections.si.edu. We've made a PDF of the entire yearbook for you. We're just going to look at a few pages here just to give you a sense of what they are and talk through a few components. But this is a really wild, in my mind, in terms of historically, kind of object. The woman who, it was a woman who owned it. Her name was Ito. Her family was there, brought all the way from California. I think there were two internment camps. There was Jerome and Rower in Arkansas. And I think of all the people who were there, only one family stayed. Everybody else went home. And then you can read the information here about the dates and more about the camp. Arkansas has done a good job of doing the history of these camps. So there's additional information if you go to the Arkansas archives, if you want to learn more about those specific internment camps. But let's look at the yearbook. If we go to the next page, I detailed some of the questions to draw out if you were to perhaps assign these in groups for students to look at a particular aspect of a yearbook. What is the purpose? You can read those, mark, it's a major life achievement, there's memories, it's your own history, but we also use it to feel connected to a community. And of course, schools can use it to build alumni, especially colleges do that. But you feel proud of this, but it is also a major milestone in one's life. And it's nice to have it all wrapped up and see those friends and those things that were meaningful, especially this being, the first major life experience and where where students have been committed for 12 or more years if they started school early. We're going to look at the question of what types of images and text comprise a yearbook. We're going to look closely at that for ours here. Who makes them and who are they for? What are the relationships between the teachers, advisors, students and committees, students and the messages? And reading those and thinking about who has what agendas and who has what power is an interesting question. What parts of it are specific to the school culture, the team sports, the mascots, the mottos, the traditions, especially if you compare them over time. It used to be who's going to be who's the smartest, who's the most likely to succeed. There were times when people put who's most likely to fail. So those are kinds of interesting questions as well. Is it sponsored by anybody in the community? Are there companies that are helping augment those the costs of publishing and that sort of thing? And then, of course, it's the students themselves. By looking at their individual images, what are they wearing? What language do they use to each other? What language gets printed when the seniors talk about what their aspirations are and what their quotes are? What are the dance themes and how are those related to either local cultures and traditions, or are they Sadie Hawkins dances, which have a long history? And then again, the other part of what can you see that's related to outside events, music references, pop culture references, lists of who's missing from the pictures, students who've died over the course of the year, or in other eras who went off to war. Sometimes schools list alumni. I've seen that, especially in college ones will list alumni, and then successes, who has made it, and who do we aspire to be from our school. So if we dig in just a little bit to Rower and the yearbook, we're going to look at what types of images and text comprise this particular yearbook. So I've just thrown up a few pages here just to give you a sense of the range of images. You can see the principal there with his American flag, which of course is going to be very important. You've got this typewritten text. You can see that it's published in mimeograph form. Hence the pages are incredibly brittle. So in the upper right hand corner, that's actually the spread. So those two pages go together, but you can see how the paper is so dry and brittle and is broken away. You can see handwritten messages and signatures that are in different colored inks. You can see that there's a class photograph. You can see that there's a rendering. I mentioned Sadie Hawkins. In this particular yearbook, you will see many, many footprints. And the reason that you see all these footprints is because it was very muddy at Rower. So they didn't, although they had buildings, they did not have sidewalks between the buildings. And then there are these pages on the right that we're going to examine more closely in a moment, which are a reporter has the dates and some of the highlights of school events. So it's just as a practice of going through and not looking and reading yet, but just beginning to identify who has written, who has a stake in this, who created it, and what are these different components that we're going to look at. So the next slide, I've given you a sample of the class picture. How is this different than what most yearbooks are? Most yearbooks will have individual photographs. We don't have individual photographs here, but we have individual names. And we're going to look at those and talk about those in just a moment. So we can ask questions about why that is. Why would not everybody's photograph be included? Could be cost and time. Obviously, this was inexpensively made. Not a lot of access to film. What was film ration? This is a question we can ask, and your students can discover whether or not silver was limited during World War II. But if we look closely at the text, and of course what makes this extraordinary is that this is a high school yearbook made by high schoolers who were there against their own will. And they're there simply because of who their parents were and what their national origin was. So if we look at the bits and pieces of this data that's collected about each student, we see their last name and their first name, and then we have their nicknames. And looking at their nicknames, it's interesting to see who chooses a less Japanese sounding name and who keeps their Japanese name. And then the next line of data is their address. So it's which bunk were they in, where were they located in the barracks. And then it has what they were, their favorite classes and their clubs. And this is what I find so interesting about this yearbook is the last line is often where they would have gone to high school had they not been here. So that gives you a sense of how diverse these people are, and they're not actually all from the same place. So if you were to begin marking where these different high schools are, you'll see that they're all over from California. Now, if you examine this class picture, you'll see that the person who is sitting front and center on the first row does not look Japanese. And in fact, she's not. And her name is up there at the top left of the second page, and her name is Betty Lou. The school at Rower was so much better than the local schools that sometimes the local kids actually came onto the internment camp and went to school there.
Wow, they opted in to be a part of it. Oh my goodness.
Yeah, so can you imagine? And so if you look at her address, she simply lives in an apartment, and it does not match the barrack numbers like the rest of the kids do. So it's a curious question. And what's also curious is this is a terrible place. It's not beautiful. They're there against their will. And yet these kids still somehow are trying to find normalcy. They're still trying to have a high school experience. And what's fascinating is when you read what the principal says to these kids about going on and having a good life and contributing to American culture, it's a very strange kind of language, and there's much to be debated and to be wrestled with in how do you manage either as a student in this environment, as a government employee who's in a situation that you may or may not agree with. How do you survive this? How do you create a normal environment? How do you continue to create and fuel the sense of being a good American, and that this is part of your citizenship, is to participate or to tolerate this. And you'll see throughout the yearbook that there are many American flags that appear either in the photographs or are drawn in.
We have a few comments from folks that are watching in. Kate says, I think these bring such a sense of humanity as well. Students will really relate to students in the past, getting their yearbooks signed and contributing themes. It's really easy to spot similarities and differences between then and now. Jennifer also says, that's an awesome avenue of inquiry. Was silver rationed? How were internment camps funded? How far were families transported for internment camps? And she also adds, yes, school is the most normal place for a young person to be.
Yeah. If we go to the next page, and building on what some of those comments are, I just want to make the point, and we've put this link in the Learning Lab, is the Library of Congress has a page or a group, what do you call it, like a lesson plan called Japanese American Internment Fear Itself. So there's some additional resources there to add to some of the questions and complexities that were raised, including, you recognize, of course, fear itself as the quote from FDR's inauguration speech. And of course, he's the one who signs Executive Order 9066 to actually put, to endorse the internment camps. And I just wanted to pull up this page. It might be a little bit difficult to read if you're on a small screen, so I apologize for that. But what's fascinating about this are these dates and what happens in, again, these questions about the school. So on May 20th, Roar has its first inter-center basketball game. So this idea that, you know, intramurals, well, if you can't participate in the regular school, well, then you're gonna compete with the other center that's there. And this idea that there's competition among these centers is kind of a striking idea. But then it goes on also to talk about what happens on July 5th and commemorating July 4th celebrations, and what does that feel like, and what does that mean? So you have this really, again, this profound moment where these high schoolers are really thinking about what does it mean to be an American citizen, and participate in this idea of July 4th and about freedom when they don't have it, and still somehow they're able to find normalcy and celebrate in that. So I think that these dates, and looking at what the reporter chose to put in and how he used language to talk about what's happening either with the superintendent of the schools coming to visit and giving them good grade, giving the school a good grade. There's a lot there. It's meaty, a lot there to tease out and talk about.
Wow, does that say July 5th, commemorating the 167th year of our independence? Wow.
It does. Yeah.
That's really incredible.
Yeah. So if we don't have, are there any other comments or suggestions for how to think about using this, or other questions that we can use the yearbook to tease out? Again, the whole yearbook is available to you at the Learning Lab, and it's also at collections.si.edu.
Yep, I think we're ready to move on to the next resource that you have for us, Shannon.
Great. So let's talk about photo albums. And then this is sort of the last big chunk that we're going to talk about, and then the other parts will come a little smaller. So don't worry, we're going to get to everything. So again, photo albums are something that people are familiar with, that they are in abundance. They're not all equally created, so to bring them into the classroom, you need to do a bit of study and think about which ones are appropriate and which ones have enough meat there. But here are some of the questions that I think about when I'm looking at albums and cataloging them. Who assembled the album? Do we know? What kinds of images are they? Are they snapshots? Are they combinations of images? We're going to see aerial photographs are included in the album that we're going to look at, as well as postcards and other kinds of materials, different kinds of snapshots. So is it really a photo album, or is it a scrapbook? Who put it together? What is the text? Is anybody adding any information? And then how is this personal, and how does it connect to a larger narrative or experience? That's what I'm looking for whenever I'm collecting photographs at the National Museum of American History. So my threshold is that I have to be able to answer the question of does this connect to the ordinary person and how does it place them in a larger historical narrative, and what is photography's role in making that visible? So those aren't three equal questions. You know, they don't get answered equally all the time. But this question of what role do you play in history is something that we can all see on very small scales and on very large scales. And snapshots allow us to begin to get into that ordinary way in which we contribute to shaping national identity, we contribute to shaping history. Is this particular album, is it representative, or is it a rare thing? How does it add to the complexity of how we understand a moment in time, or a group of people, an event? And that may be sometimes not the whole album, but maybe particular images within the album. And then, of course, this is the most important part, is what questions are unanswered, because that actually can be most important in helping us know how much we can invest in the document. So that's that verification question of, like, as a historical document, can we apply it broadly, or can we only apply it to a few people? Okay, so let's look at this album. Here again, we have the first page. Here's the cover. It was put together by a guy named Harry A. Spencer. He was from East Tennessee. He goes on this World War I journey. He's going to go. He's going to come back. We're going to track him. He puts this album together for himself. The family used it a lot and looked at it a lot, so it's quite worn. You can't see it here, but it's held together by a black shoelace. Which, of course, the materials of this say something, and the way its condition actually says something about it. One might think it's actually unloved by how used it is, but actually it's because people kept touching it, people wanted to hold it, people wanted to connect to Grandpa. And this was donated by his granddaughter. All right, so let's have a look. So again, this whole thing is available for you online in the Learning Lab. You can see the whole thing, and what I've got for you here on the next few slides are different strategies for how one might use this album, how a classroom might take parts of it to study it. This is just for the first 5 pages of the album. We can track his service. So I've matched it with the text from where we can see he traveled. Of course, these are tiny pictures probably on your screen, but they're just representative of the images. So you can see it's images and text. He's given us dates and he's given us locations, so we can match some of that. Camp Green, I don't know where Camp Green is. It can be studied. Where can we find Camp Green in 1917? Where was that? And I've paired it here with a map that was printed in 1919. And this is roads and trains. So by using the map and thinking about transportation, how did he get from Denver, Colorado to Charlotte, North Carolina? Well, in 1917, he's not taking a plane. So what is that experience like, getting from Denver to Charlotte, North Carolina, to getting up to New York City? So just in terms of mapping and thinking about his tour of service. Okay, and then the next one, we can do the same thing with this, his individual experience of moving across Europe. So again, he's got dates and locations and talking a little bit about some of the events that he was, and battles he was a part of. So it's interesting to track one person's experience against what we know as the larger historical narrative. What does that look like, and how is it the same? What does it take to move from one part of Europe to another? What does it look like as he moves from one part to another? So it would just be an interesting experience, again, to track, to go through, mark those dates, mark those battles, and then see what it looks like on the map. So next slide. So if you didn't want to do the mapping and looking at all the different places, because that actually is quite time consuming, I think, looking at the album for these different themes that appear, and these are 3 things that struck me as ways to use the album and things to look for. And clearly the theme that has arisen today in today's photography session is all about the humanity and photography connecting us to the people of another time period, so that we see them as people and not as figures and not as random figures. So there's a lot in here about military life. That picture on the top left, he's talking about his new tin hat. The picture on the right, again, these are a little bit hard to see probably because they're small on your screen. He's talking about the barber. And then he goes to Paris, and what is Paris like? And then he's back in his civilian clothes. So this trajectory of being with the troop and being with your guys and then getting back home. There's an emotional journey, as well as what is military life really like. There's a lot of waiting in between. The vehicles and transportation of World War I is fascinating. As many of you know, it's the last time we use horses. It's the first time we use tanks. So there's this interesting mix of transportation and vehicles and weapons that are visible in this album that talks about technological change and the impact of technology on warfare. I happen to think World War I is such an interesting time because our lives change so much. We throw off, after World War I, we're going to throw off Victorian America, and we're going to embrace germ theory, and we're going to have clean lines, and the art represents that, and the technology represents that, and there's this really interesting dynamic. The other part of that is that with vehicles and transportation, it changes the way that we see the world. So I mentioned a moment ago that there are aerial views, and the aerial views look very much like Richard Diebenkorn paintings. So there's this idea that we can see the world differently, where Impressionism and trains gave us Impressionism. There's World War I and World War II, because of the deconstruction and because of the landscape that is changed, artists respond to these physical changes, as well as the political unrest and conflict. And then there's actually of course, the effects of war. So the top picture is a cemetery. The second picture that I have for you there that you can see are other images of churches that are destroyed. So the cultural heritage is erased. What does that mean in a war? To change not only to lose people, but to destroy those things that have stood for thousands of years. The third image is a shell that's stuck in a tree. He says this is not an uncommon image. What does that mean? What would it be like to walk through the landscape and see shells buried in trees? And then the last one is, again, back to the technology. This is a bridge that was built in France that was based on a bridge in New York. So this question about technology, what do we leave behind, and mobility, and it's not always destruction, but what comes out of war, as we know, lots of innovation happens during wartime. So this one album, it's about 83 pages, has a tremendous amount of text, and just even a few pages and a few images can help us understand the complexity and nuances of life as a soldier, and that what is that intersection as a single individual with both the political story as well as the war story, the international story. What are the politics like? How do we negotiate that? So I really like this album for being able to bring a deeper level of complexity and subtlety to the story of World War I. And then
we had a teacher actually mention that it's a good geography connection, and I realized too within your discussion of this album that you actually connected to art and technology innovation. And so I think there's a few ways that you could kind of use this as a gateway for interdisciplinary learning, for sure. And then we also had a colleague said, looking at the PDF scan of the album, it's so interesting reading his commentary, what he chooses to say about each photograph included.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a perfect segue, because the next slide, I talk about the language. That just looking at his language is important. So here are just three small clips from larger pages. So the first one is the vision of all men when homesick in the AEF. Questions about men being homesick and what is the AEF. And of course we see the Statue of Liberty. More Heinz showing, I can't read it from here.
Showing an officer who happened to get
in the way of something rough. Okay. So just like the question, what do we call the enemy? What do we call, something rough? Well, clearly it's more than something rough. They were shot at and they were captured German soldiers. And then finally, the girl who welcomed us home. So these, again, the girl who welcomed us home, you could connect that to that wartime picture of back to VJ Day, even though that's World War II. What are men going off to fight for, and why is it men, and what does it mean now that actually women may be drafted now and have to register for the selective service? So there's some good questions I think that's there, and I think that the teacher who mentioned language, I think it's really important to look at the language he's using both to comfort himself, language that's using as a strategy for thinking about the other, and what is he fighting for. Okay, anything else that has emerged, Ashley?
It looks like we're good to go to the next resource.
Great.
This is one of my favorites too.
You also want to make sure that you see what Brianna White did, and she had some really good stuff there. And the strategies that she used are, can be incorporated, of course, into history classrooms as well. Many of those artifacts that she brought up in that artwork has similar context. I wanted to point this particular photographer out to you. We're going to look at his photographs and this inspiration from his photographs. These are works that I've collected. And Robert Weingarten is a contemporary photographer living and working in Southern California. You've got the link to his website right there. There's a group of photographs that he did called the Portraits Unbound. And essentially he asked the subjects, if you couldn't be in a photograph, but you made yourself portrait, what would you include? And so what they began to include were things that mattered to them, things that shaped their lives, things that made them who they are. Now he went to iconic Americans. So you see the iconic things, right? So this is Hank Aaron, 44, you know that number. And you see baseball, it's a baseball stadium. But what's also really important is that train. He was not allowed to travel with the rest of his team during his career because it was a segregated society. So he had his own train car because he couldn't stay in hotels and things like that. You'll see clowns down there in the lower right-hand corner from Negro League days. So, and then there's language there from the Hank Aaron Foundation. And what I really like about these photographs is they're not just collages of images laid together. What they really represent is this life. And there are images that float closer to the surface and loom larger. And then there are other parts of it that they recede, that may not be quite as visible, but still impactful to the way that these people's lives are shaped, and that they're shaped by things other than what they're famous for. Something had to help them get to what they're famous for. So I like these in thinking about objects. Of course, we're at the National Museum of American History and the Smithsonian. We're all about the stuff, the thing, the physicality, and what are the stories that surround the objects. And what happens when you put them into a larger and larger context and you put other images and objects in relationship to them. And that's, of course, what you're building in the learning labs, are all these interesting ways of connecting objects and stories to build larger narratives that have complexity and meaning. So I'd encourage you to check out the Weingarten photographs and have a look at those. On the next page of our show here, I've got a couple of links for you. We've done quite a lot with Robert Weingarten and the photographs. The first one is a blog that actually came to us. It's a letter to Mr. Weingarten. This woman, the image that you see is for Colin Powell. And she writes to him, she's a teacher, and writes to him and tells him how her class has made collages of them, they've made self-portraits using these ideas of what has shaped them, what is important to them. And she sees her students in a new way, and they see themselves in an interesting way as well. And then we worked with him to create a portrait exclusively for us of Celia Cruz, and that was it was an interesting way how we got to Celia Cruz. She was voted on by the public, but these are all objects that are in our collection. So again, the idea that these objects have power, they have presence, and they have meaning and complexity. So just to give you a sense of maybe how to think about those images and how we think about building histories and thinking about individuals who are important to us and important to our culture. So the first part of this was very much about either the anonymity of the subjects in those photojournalistic portraits for the most part. And then we had the two albums, the yearbook and the album, that were very much about individuals who would be otherwise lost to history if it weren't for those objects that are at the museum. And then here we can think about how do we look at and think about what makes these leaders and the people that have made it, the biographies, what has shaped them to prepare them to take on these big moments, to make them iconic. And then, I wanted to mention just before we could stay on this, but I wanted to mention also in connection with the yearbook and thinking about photographers, we've put a link into the Learning Lab of work by Ansel Adams, a well-known photographer, mostly a landscape photographer is what he's known for, but he did this fantastic series called Born Free and Equal, in which he talked his way into photographing Manzanar in California. So they're beautiful photographs of the people who lived there, but he wrote the text himself because the War Department the War Department censored his photographs, but they didn't censor his text. So it's quite biting in sometimes. So to see this connection to text with the photograph, and how do they work together, and how do they bounce off of each other, and how does one person who has status, who has a kind of celebrity, to be able to get into a place that he is morally against, and then what does he do with wanting to own that responsibility and possibility and platform that he has. So that link is there to the Library of Congress collection of those images. So just some ideas that I thought about, embedded these again with my son, ideas for using photographs in the classroom, just what I've seen. Both of my kids have done timelines where they've drawn the line and they've put the dates and the events on that. But I've always thought, well, if you put a photograph with it, if you put an image with it, then you do a little bit of thinking, because you have to make a choice. Well, if I put World War II down in 1942, what image am I going to choose to mark that? And then to be able to compare those. And I'm a visual person, so I need sort of visual cues sometimes to remember those dates. So just thinking about adding that as a component to timeline building.
That's a great idea. Actually, one of the most recent tools and features of the Learning Lab is a new sorting activity. And basically, you're able to create a linear spectrum, which is also another word for a timeline. You could start, at the beginning of the photo album to, when he returns home. And I could easily see someone being able to kind of map out the specific photo album or specific events over time, 1900 to 2000. But again, using objects and visuals that might perhaps help students kind of think through what was actually going on at that time versus, just simple dates and text. So I love that idea. That's a really, really great idea, and something that the Learning Lab can assist with. So
excellent.
Wonderful.
And then you could also do you could create a fictitious scrapbook, or a team or a group could create a fictitious scrapbook and create a life for somebody, and then draw in images, again, to connect that, create a fictitious person, but connect them to a particular event. My son's idea, what he said he would like to do, is to do a close study of a photograph and then write a historical fiction about it. So he wanted somebody to give him a photograph. He wanted to pick out elements of it and then do that, that kind of a fiction writing. I don't know how much collaboration there is, depending on what kind of school environment you're in, whether it's interdisciplinary or not. But certainly, if you can match with, if your students are reading Farewell to Manzanar, for example, looking at some of those photographs from Manzanar and writing historical fiction or doing the research might be a way to do some crossover with between the literature English classes. And then, of course, you can create collages and montages for historical figures, learning about who they are, what is their biography, how do you represent them visually, and not just necessarily maybe in a report kind of format, but thinking about how would you bring those elements together to make points and what shaped their lives.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Shannon. I think you have one more slide, but I did want to mention one of the, in the chat while we were going through, someone had mentioned thanks for the resources regarding the yearbook, and they said, I would love to pair this with the George Takei TED Talk, which I hadn't heard of, but I know is regarding his time in the internment camps. And then another colleague mentioned, well, when I looked up the camp, I actually saw that Takei's family was there for a short period of time. And so even making those connections is really quite interesting. So
I'm glad you made that connection. I think it was his older brother maybe who was there. But yeah, so that again makes it very real. And then these are just some additional resources for if you want to read more about how to read photographs. These are 3 different kinds of approaches. The first one is more at a very high level. The second one digs down a little bit further, and then the one on the right with the blue box, they actually do some nice vocabulary building with images. So when you want to talk about composition and how does your eye move around and how is the photograph constructed, there's some actual vocabulary building that can ensure that everybody's on the same page.
Wonderful. Well, wow, this hour has certainly flown by. I am so grateful to Shannon for sharing all of these great resources, different types of media for us to look through, to think about, great questions, lots of strategies for analyzing all of these in the classroom, making connections to other subjects and disciplines, and of course being vetted by a high school student as well. That's always good. So you know your students will enjoy some of these activities as well and really start kind of stimulating their thinking. All of the resources that you've seen in today's session are archived within the Smithsonian Learning Lab, including this online session. So if you want to go back, rewind, find exactly that section that was of most interest to you, you certainly can. And like I said, all of the resources are there as well. And what's nice about the Learning Lab is we're able to pull in external resources, some of the PDFs too. So in addition to over 1.8 million resources from the Smithsonian, I always joke, if that's not enough for you, you can actually bring in everything from the internet as well as all of your digital files. So if you have a graphic organizer or something like that that you'd like to use alongside some of these images, that's certainly something you can do within the Learning Lab. And finally, I just wanted to mention that we originally, when we started the school year, we said that we would have 3 sessions within this series. And so we had started with objects and then moved on to portraits. And today's session was about photography. And I'm delighted to mention that in April, we have what we're calling a bonus Google Hangout. And so we will be joined by Archivist Sierra Green from the Senator John Heinz History Center. And that's actually a Smithsonian affiliate museum in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And she is just fabulous. She's a wonderful storyteller and also has such a gift for being able to really pique students' interest by scaffolding documents and thinking about how we present information to students. So we're really looking forward to that, and that will be posted via social media as well as on our YouTube channel. And without further ado, I think we just hit the 1 hour mark. So thanks everybody, and be sure to share with a friend.